Good afternoon, everyone. I am excited to be here today to introduce the SGS webinar for clinical and post-market surveillance requirements under the MDR. My name is Greg Jacobson. I'm the Sales Director for SGS North America Medical Division. Your speaker today is Balazs Bozic. Balazs is our Technical Director for Medical Devices in the US. A bit about us. SGS is the world's leading inspection, verification, testing, and certification company. We have over 98,000 employees worldwide in over 2,600 locations around the world and expertise across 7 global industry sectors. We provide assistance and expertise with global support and services that cater to all industries. We are the largest provider of audits, certification, training, and advisory services. We have the ability to turn your needs into comprehensive solutions with a consistent service delivery via our worldwide network and global footprint. We have highly experienced quality and regulatory experts in the medical device certification area, ready to offer training to you from our SGS Academy. At the end of the presentation, we'll have several links for you to SGS Academy. An email will be sent later with a link to this recording and a copy of this presentation. There will be Q&A at the end, so please put all your questions in the chat box so we can discuss them at the end of the presentation. There will be a survey on your screen. Please fill it out at the end. Thank you for joining us today. To start, I'll turn it over to Balazs.
Thank you, Greg. Today we are going to talk about the main differences of the clinical evaluation process and the post-market process compared to the MDD to MDR. We're going to look at the EU MDR manufacturer's clinical evaluation process, focusing on the differences, explanation of new or reinforced concepts and definitions, expectations where new clinical investigation is expected and when it can be waived for different classes of devices. We are going to talk about any changes in the clinical investigation plans, ethics committees, etc. I'm going to mention the relevance and the applicability of the new MDCG guidelines where applicable. It might not be collected as one block, probably it's going to be peppered as part of other slides. And we are going to look at the clinical evaluation assessment workflow from a notified body and competent authority perspective, including the consultation process where applicable. So roughly this is in the main part. And of course, I'm also going to talk about post-market information. So that's just one block, basically, and some of the new deliverables like the PSUR and the SSCP. All right, so when this webinar was, promoted as talking about the up-classified devices and the different requirements to the up-classified devices under MDR. And I think for that, it's important to maybe take a quick glance at what were those up-classified devices. And this is just a very quick collection. So because now the MDR covers the previous medical device directive and active implantable medical device directive. All active implantable devices and their accessories are considered class 3. Substance-based devices intended to be used via the body orifice or applied on the skin may not be class 1 as under MDD and may now be up-classified to class 2A or 2B. Certain software that are currently covered by Rule 11 may be up-classified even up to class 3. All non-invasive devices consisting of a substance or a mixture of substances intended to be used in vitro, indirect contact with human cells, tissues, or organs taken from the human body or used in vitro with human embryos before their implantation or administration into the body are now classified as class 3. All devices intended specifically for direct contact with the heart or central circulatory systems are now class 3. Like devices in contact with the central nervous system before. Breast implants, surgical meshes, and total and partial joint replacements now fall into class 3. Some of these devices were already class 3 before, but now the range has been extended under MDR. Spinal disc replacement implants or implantable devices that come into contact with the spinal column are now class 3, with some exceptions. We are going to talk about the well-established technologies later. Disinfectants and sterilizers fall into class 2B if they are used for invasive devices and as the endpoint of processing. Previously, it was mostly just implants, but now disinfectants and sterilization chambers, if they were used for implants, they were class 2B. Now it's for all invasive devices. So again, the range has been extended there. When you are looking at the clinical evaluation requirements on the face of it, and historically it may look like that there are no new requirements because the MDR basically just took the previous MEDDEV 2.7/1 revision 4, which was already applicable for MDD, and put it into the MDR 1-to-1. So it may seem like, again, on the surface, that there are no new clinical requirements. Indeed, the process pretty much remains the same. So the main task items in the planning phase, the manufacturer needs to define the purpose and the scope of the clinical evaluation. They have to determine the pathway to clinical evaluation. In this case, you have to decide what sources are you going to use. I've seen manufacturers who at this point already exclude even the possibility that they will need to do clinical investigation, which I think is a little bit too early because you have to see what else you find. We are going to talk about that later. You have to outline the plan for this clinical evaluation procedure, and you have to already in advance have to establish a maintenance cycle for the clinical evaluation report. This will tie into the post-market clinical follow-up, as we will discuss later. Once you have the plan ready, then you will go into the clinical evaluation process itself. So in this stage, you will identify all clinical data. And this usually comes from two sources. One is data generated and held by the legal manufacturer, so this is your own data, and you will also consider the external data. Usually the two endpoints for clinical evaluation is to make sure and prove or provide evidence that the device is safe and effective for its intended use. And the data that you will be looking for sometimes needs to be slightly differently worded or differently even searched for the two purposes. So one example is for when you do a literature search, for example, for performance, usually you try to narrow the search to make it very specific for the features and the performance level and the characteristics of your device. Whereas when you are searching to show evidence that your device does not pose unacceptable risk, then your net, your search terms should usually be cast more wider and should be more broadly worded because devices that might be more different than your device, but if they share common functionalities, may still be relevant for the safety claims. So let me give you an example. If you have a CT with 128 slices, that maybe for a performance perspective, you want to, and the effectiveness perspective, you want to search for information for exactly 128 slice CTs to show what additional benefit it provides over a less slice count older CT device. So that would be one type of search. But for a safety perspective, to make sure that the device is safe, you would not limit your search to 128 slice only. You would look for all CTs or even all X-ray devices or even all devices with moving parts because those share common risks with your CT device. So your search terms would need to be much broader to make sure that you haven't missed any relevant adverse events, for example, that might have already been previously reported that you can learn from as a manufacturer. So again, the two search terms might be different. Once you identified all the data that is available out there, then you have to sift through and see what data is relevant for your case or for your clinical evaluation. and that is the appraisal phase. So in that you will check if you can or need to exclude certain articles or certain pieces of data based on language, based on not following a scientific method, etc., etc. But you have to be very careful, and the MDR text will give you a proper breakdown of what are the considerations that you have to make and what is the level of transparency that you have to maintain to make sure that if an external reviewer wants to retrace your steps, they will come to the same conclusion as you did, so that you did not unjustifiably throw out certain articles that may shed bad light on your product. Once you have eliminated the non-admissible clinical evidence, or clinical data, then you will start the analysis. Usually, this analysis will prove, that your device is safe and effective for the intended use. One of the problems that we typically run into is that manufacturers neglect or misrepresent the reliability of the information in this. I mean, there can be many failure modes at this stage, but the one thing that we often see, especially for novel technologies, is that some of these articles and scientific literature articles may have a conclusion which clearly explains that that study was inconclusive, or it requires additional follow-up in the future because the technology is rapidly evolving, or we don't know the long-term physiological effect of the device, and so it will require some follow-up. And that level of uncertainty is kind of skipped from being represented in the final report. And in the past, we had problems with some manufacturers who built on such shaky foundations, and in the conclusion section of their clinical evaluation report, they didn't mention that there's any uncertainty. And in the past, that was their maybe justification of not having a post-market clinical follow-up. So just make sure that if there are uncertainties in the income or input clinical data, that you faithfully represent those uncertainties in your conclusion as well, and handle those uncertainties by requiring a higher level of follow-up. Once you've done that, then you will need to have your conclusions from the analyzed data, and drafting the final report, you will submit the report to your notified body as part of the technical documentation. They will review that, then you will respond to the notified body findings and update the clinical evaluation report, and then you will maintain the clinical evaluation report in accordance with the plan that you have outlined in stage 0. So that's roughly the clinical evaluation process. Again, on the face of it, there's nothing new. But if we look at some of the other concepts that I will discuss a little bit later, you will see that there's a bunch of new details for both legacy products and new products. When it comes to the post-market evaluation and clinical evaluation over the whole product lifecycle, you can see that basically it starts at the risk management and design and development processes early on in the device lifecycle, and then you will iterate on these as you go forward. So from the risk management, you will create a risk management plan. Then when you carry out a given round of activities, then you will generate a risk management report, overall risk management file. From the design and development, you will have the clinical evaluation plan. When executed, it will result in a clinical evaluation report. Then when you go into the post-market phase, so this happens pre-market. When you have the post-market phase, you will look at the production process, post-production process, and that will all have a feedback back to risk management, and that in turn will impact revised design and development. So for example, design changes. From this stage, these will feed into the post-market clinical follow-up plan. I'm going to talk about how that concept has changed. Post-market surveillance plan. And then these will result in some deliverables. So you will have the post-market clinical follow-up report, post-market surveillance report. And if your device is higher than class, so if it's class 1, then that's the only thing that you need. If it's higher than class 1, then you will also need a periodical safety update report, the PSUR. And if anything happens to your device, if there are adverse events and vigilance cases, then you will have a vigilance process, and the vigilance report will also feed into the PMS report, which in turn talks about the PSUR. And also, there's another document that is the SSCP. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later when we will talk about post-market. So this is just the overall landscape, and everything that's marked here as documents, those are applicable deliverables for these processes, and the notified body and the competent authorities will usually want to see these unless some of these documents are not applicable for your product. But most of the time, these will all be applicable. Just a very quick comparison chart when we are talking about clinical data. There is a concept in the MDR that you have to have sufficient clinical data in order to have a conclusive result of your clinical evaluation. And there are a bunch of different clinical data types. However, these data types have now been, and you can see that the different data types have different pros and cons. Even the strongest type of clinical data, which would be an investigation, has its weaknesses and shortcomings in some dimensions. So overall, to have sufficient clinical data means to have sufficient coverage of all of these dimensions by different types of clinical evidence. It's also important to point out that in the MDR, preclinical testing and data and similar devices representing the state of the art are not considered clinical data. So again, the definition has been clarified a little bit. I talked already about sufficient clinical data. There's an MDCG guidelines that talks about sufficient clinical data for legacy devices. Legacy devices for our practical purposes now will mean MDD certified devices or AIMDD certified devices. When we look at the state of the art, it has not been, there's no new definition. The concept is pretty much the same as in MEDDEV 2.7/1 revision 4. And there is still not one uniform definition. So it's more like a concept that manufacturers need to think about, and their concept has to somehow be based in reality, and the notified bodies are going to check that. When it comes to equivalent devices, there's a reinforced guideline in the MDCG 2020-5, which will talk about what are the conditions under which equivalency can be claimed, and that can give some exemption from having to collect further clinical data. And then another new concept is post-market clinical follow-up, which is in some case similar to the previous MEDDEV guideline 2.12/2, but in the MDR Annex 14 Part B also extends this with new guidelines, and there are two templates, the MDCG 2020-7 and -8 for the plan and the report respectively. And so basically, essentially now all devices with novel feature or novel clinical procedures need post-market clinical follow-up. Because under the MDR, the post-market clinical follow-up definition changed also to mean the periodic updates to the clinical evaluation report. So that act that was previously done and requested by Annex 10 of the MDD, but it was not understood to be part of the PMCF umbrella. The PMCF was typically needed if some of the clinical data was inconclusive and we didn't know the full effect of the device on the patients for the full technical lifetime. Then, and usually only then, we needed post-market clinical follow-up. But for devices where we already knew the full physiological effect on the lifetime of the product, then this was usually not needed. Now the post-market clinical follow-up also means and includes the periodic update of the clinical evaluation report, and in that sense, post-market clinical follow-up is typically needed for all types of medical devices. All right. So the typical pitfall that we encounter is still justifying no PMCF, which is generally not acceptable under the MDR. All right. Another aspect that has been reinforced is in which cases clinical data not required. This was already part and allowed, generally speaking, in the MDD, but the rules were not very clear. And now we have a little bit more clarity of when clinical data is not required. And so per the MDR Article 61, subsection 10, without prejudice to paragraph 4, which talks about implantable and class 3 devices, where the demonstration of conformity with general safety and performance requirements based on clinical data is not deemed appropriate, adequate justification for any such exception shall be given based on the results of the manufacturer's risk management, consideration of the specifics of the interaction between device and the human body, the clinical performance intended, and the claims of the manufacturer. In such case, the manufacturer shall duly substantiate in the technical documentation referred to in Annex 2 why it considers a demonstration of conformity with the GSPR that is based on the results of non-clinical testing methods alone, including performance evaluation, bench testing, and preclinical evaluation to be adequate. So the manufacturer needs to provide burden. But just to give you a little bit of maybe a taste of what the notified body is looking for and what the regulators are looking for, what kind of devices would we find it reasonable to justify that the clinical evaluation is done, or you don't need clinical data to show compliance with GSPR requirements? For example, disinfecting solutions to disinfect medical devices, catheter mounts between catheter and like a breathing mask or something like that, fridge intended for storing blood or tissues, or surgical scalpels. So the things that you would generally consider is the risk of the device. So most of these are low-risk devices, class 1 devices typically. That's one. And the second is the nature and duration of the patient contact. So you can see that 3 out of 4 devices do not have patient contact at all. And for the surgical scalpels, the patient contact is very like short duration, transient use. So in that sense, we can ask the question, can this route be used to implantable and class 3 devices? And the answer there is clearly no. If I go back to the previous slide, you can see that in the text, it explicitly says that without prejudice to paragraph 4, and paragraph 4 talks about class 3 and implantable devices. So those devices are by definition exempt from this. So all class 3 and implantable devices need clinical evidence, and probably that is not a very big shocker to anyone. The other question is, can a device take this route because it is a well-established technology or legacy device? And the answer is that it may or may not, but it is not depending on whether it's a well-established technology or because it is a legacy device. So it is more about those factors that I mentioned before, about patient contact and about the risk of the device. So just because they are well-established technology or legacy device, it doesn't automatically mean that they can follow this route. We have to look at the nature of the device, patient contact, and the risk class of the device. When we look at the clinical evaluation plan, there's a couple of new or reinforced requirements. It is very important to point out the target group. The clinical evaluation report has to explicitly cover all non-excluded patient and user groups. So previously, we have seen where manufacturers intended the device to be used, or at least did not exclude the use, or did not indicate in the contraindications for certain groups that typically require special consideration, like pregnant women, lactating women, children of different age groups, elderly patients, or anything like that. And this now has to be explicitly addressed. So if your intended use in your IFU and in your marketing materials allows this device to be used by everybody, then we will look for a clinical evaluation report that explicitly addresses all user groups. So if we will see that you have never checked whether the device can safely be used by pregnant women, the notified body is going to challenge that clinical evaluation report and will ask you to either mark that as a contraindication or get more clinical evidence that the device indeed can safely be used for that product, for that user group. The second one is the clinical benefit profile with relevant and specified clinical outcome parameters, because now under MDR Article 2, the benefit of the device is defined. And I am going to talk a little bit more about benefit in the next slide. The residual risk and side effect acceptability should be based on the state of the art. So basically, you will need now to look at your device in the context, not just by itself. And so the acceptability of the risk is not only decided considering that it's either using this device or nothing, but you have to look at the utility and the safety and the effectiveness of your device in the context of the whole world, basically, whatever is relevant. So it might be a competitor's medical device, but it can be also like state-of-the-art, includes all those different methods in the world that can reach the same clinical benefit as your device. So it can be a lifestyle change. It can be pharmaceutical use instead of medical device use. It can be your competitor's medical device use. So you have to consider this as well. And when you look at it from that angle, for example, if your device can only perform a surgery in a full open method, and your competitor's product can reach the very same goal with a minimally invasive one, then likely your device is not considered state-of-the-art, with all as things equal. So these are the kind of considerations that you have to support in the clinical evaluation report. And this is also, I would say, nothing new. Other regulators, even in the past, asked for this. So I know that the US FDA already asked you to consider the state of the art. And if they have evidence that there are some other devices or other maybe drugs that can reach the same benefit with smaller side effects or smaller risks, then they are going to challenge your device, whether it has any place on the market. The clinical development plan is now mandatory. Clinical development plan is essentially the plan for your clinical investigation. So it's very specific. It's different than the clinical evaluation plan. The clinical development plan is a plan for your clinical investigations. If you have more than one investigations for the same device or for different devices, then these have to be summarized in the clinical development plan. And the MDR gives you the specific requirements to this plan. I'm not going to go into more details, but for this level, it is enough to say that it is mandatory, so please pay attention to that one. And the typical pitfall that we encounter is that the clinical evaluation plan does not meet the MDR requirements. So the clinical evaluation plan, if it doesn't mention any of these concepts or just glosses over them or is too brief or is ambiguous in any of these aspects, that it may be challenged by the notified body already. So I mentioned previously about clinical benefits. And this is a topic that is a little bit underdeveloped, I think, still in the medical device industry. There were some attempts already in the ISO 14971-2012 edition, the EN-ISO 2012 edition, that try to talk about the benefit and how, you know, you should not just set up an arbitrary acceptance level for your risk, but the risk should be weighed against the benefit of the device. So if the device has higher benefit, then we are tolerating higher risk of using the device. So if you have, for example, a linear accelerator for radiotherapy treatment of cancer patients who already have cancer, then the risk of the linear accelerator causing more cancer is not as severe as, for example, if you have an acne treatment laser device, which is to treat, skin defects or skin conditions in an otherwise healthy patient. We would definitely not accept an acne laser treatment to cause cancer and melanoma in the patient. So that is maybe just to illustrate the concept that the risk benefit should also take into consideration the benefit. However, if you try to do the right thing and you want to have a detailed benefit profile or want to establish a detailed benefit profile for the device to make it an apples to apples comparison against the risk profile, then you will very quickly run into issues trying to come up with a robust and reproducible method. So you will ask a bunch of questions. Should it be per the individual, for the whole user population? Do we expect quantities or just qualitative description of the benefit? What factors does such a good quantitative scale contain? For example, the US FDA has some guidelines on this topic also for the medical device industry, which was borrowed from the pharmaceutical industry. And in that one, they split the severity factor to two other factors, which is magnitude and duration of the effect. So altogether now you have the probability or occurrence, and then you have magnitude of the effect and duration of the effect. And these three factors can be used both for the benefits and both for the risks, and it kind of makes them comparable. So for the, over the population, for certain number of patients, you will have certain level of benefit and certain level of risk, and this can be defined for the different patient groups and user groups. So overall, in that way, you can develop a risk-benefit profile. Are you looking at absolute or relative benefits, which can be supported by statistical data? So relative benefit takes into account the starting condition of the patient. Absolute benefit only talks about where the patient ended up being in their health state or quality of life. Do we compare just one desired benefit to all residual risk, or do we also consider the positive side effects or just quality of life in general? How to consider the initial state of the patient, different worst outcomes are acceptable. Yeah, I already talked about this example. How to quantify benefit for diagnostic devices. Do we take the smallest benefit of all the treatments? Its results will be used to. And preventive devices. So for treatment devices, or therapeutic devices, it's relatively simple to establish the benefit of the device. But for diagnosis and prevention, it's a little bit more blurry, and you have to be careful about how you define this. And by the way, you guys will have access to these slide decks later. So I'm not going to go through every single word. You can read this later and follow up on the links as well. The next one, do we need to, and if so, how can we detach from the economical effect of the benefit? So for example, through different financing in different markets, your device can be affordable or can reach a different number of patients. And if we project the benefit of your device to the population, then, how would that factor in the different financing models, health insurance and all that? And do we even need to consider that, or do we just use some other metric to find the total population for the device? So these are all, I would say, relevant questions, and each manufacturer will need to factor these in and maybe some other questions as well to establish a fair and reproducible benefit profile for their device. When we talk about clinical investigation, and this is outlined in the MDR Article 61, Annex 15, and the MDCG2020-06 guidelines. So clinical investigation is expected for Class 3 devices and implantable devices by default, unless you can justify why they are not needed. But, realistically, for a notified body, you will have a very hard time justifying these. There are a couple of cases where it is already offered in the MDR that you can have exemptions, and these would be if you have equivalence from the same manufacturer through some other device. You can have equivalence from not the same legal manufacturer. You can have equivalent, or you can have some evidence or relevant experience from relevant or legacy devices, or it is part of a list of exempted devices per the MDR Article 61.6b. And there is a new, relatively new Commission guidance on the content and structure of the summary of the clinical investigation report, which was published relatively recently in May 2023. So these are the generic considerations for that. And of course, there's some different, and we're going to talk about that, of what, of some of these when we are going to look at the MDCG 2020-01-05 and 06 in a future slide. Okay, when it comes to combination products, the important message of this slide is that you have to consider whether if it's, and this slide talks about combination products between a medical device and the pharmaceutical drug or a medicinal product. And you have to first decide which one is the dominant part of the device, which part is ancillary to the other one. And so if it is a device, for example, intended to administer a medicinal product is one case, or a device incorporating a medicinal substance is another case. And then you have to look at, in first case, whether it's an integral part or not integral part. And the second one, is it a drug with an ancillary mode of action or a drug with a principal mode of action? And depending on these selections, your device might be regulated under the MDR or might be regulated under the pharmaceutical regulations, which may require a notified body opinion. So in some cases, for example, if you have a device that is primarily used to deliver some drugs, or like a pre-filled syringe or something like that, that contains a medical device, then maybe the overall thing will be considered a drug and will be regulated as a drug. But in order to put that product on the market, the regulators may ask that for the syringe portion, the notified body should give an opinion to the manufacturer whether the syringe fulfills the general safety and performance requirements of the MDR as well. So just be mindful that the pathways might be different in this case. And new and legacy devices both need new consultation process. So that means that even if such a combination product had the CE marking or was put on the EU market legally under the MDD, and you had performed the necessary consultation process, that device will need a new consultation process under the MDR if you want to keep selling that. And there's an MDCG guideline 2020-12 that talks about this. All right, so one of the bigger new guidelines, MDCG 2020-05, it talks about equivalence of devices. This was already a concept under the MEDDEV guidelines, but now some of the concepts have been refined, and this really is a new content to the MDR that was not present under MDD. So the important aspect is that there are three aspects or dimensions of equivalence. One is the technical equivalence, biological and clinical equivalence. For the technical one, we talk about similarities. I think previously the word that was used that the devices had to be identical. Now they only have to be similar, but it seems to be really just semantics, because when you look at it, it really looks for a very high level of similarity. So it depends on the device. For example, a cemented and non-cemented femoral stem for a hip implant are not similar. Also, like sterile and non-sterile devices, these kind of things would not be considered similar. So you have to consider that. And the same considerations go for biological or clinical evidence. The guideline will give you examples of what is considered equivalent, what is not, from these different aspects. Equivalence has to have proper scientific justification based on preclinical data. Just a superficial comparison is not sufficient. We have seen in the past many cases where in the clinical evaluation report, there was a comparison table of the manufacturer's device, which was in the scope of the clinical evaluation, and some competitors' devices or the manufacturer's own previous generation products. But the equivalence was supported by just a very superficial set of criteria. There was a picture that it kind of looks the same, and some cherry-picked parameters, performance parameters, that showed that there are a number of features and parameters that are equivalent. But now the new requirement is that you should explicitly highlight the differences and justify why the differences are not relevant. So the notified body will need to see a fair representation of the similarities and the differences. If we only see that you are just trying to shed a good light, but we find significant differences where we don't find a justification from you why it's not causing a problem, or why it's still considered to be an equivalent device, we are going to challenge you. And at that point, you will have a very hard time getting your new product through the conformity assessment, because it sometimes can take a long time to evaluate those differences. So be proactive and highlight those differences in a fair way already in the beginning. When it comes to the legal, because of course, in order for you to do a robust job at finding the equivalence and the similarities and differences between devices, sometimes you need to have a good level of access to not only the marketing information about the other devices, but sometimes you need deeper information. For example, you may need to have the access to their clinical evaluation report, their technical documentation, and of course, when it's a competitor situation, most likely they will not grant you access to this unless it's a merger and acquisition situation or something like that. And so the guideline also regulates the sufficient level of access. So for implantable and class 3 devices from a different legal manufacturer, there's an explicit contract needed and must be the predicate device must be MDR certified. If it's from the same legal manufacturer, the predicate device can be certified under the MDD, MDR, AIMDD, and their CE certificates should still be valid. And of course, now that puts an extra spin because of the MDD validity extension situation. For lower class devices, so this was for implantable and class 3s, for lower class devices, it can be certified to the MDR, MDD, or AIMDD. There is no formal contract required. The devices can even be non-CE marked so long as the legal manufacturer has sufficient access to the documentation and that the clinical data conforms to the international standards and meet the MDR requirements. There are some potential pitfalls to avoid. Yeah, basically, I think I already mentioned both of these points. All right, for the other guideline, the MDCG2020-06 talks about sufficient clinical data for legacy devices, MDD and AIMDD legacy devices. The important aspect is that the guideline helps to assess adequacy of these older era clinical data and helps to find the gaps which will be needed for additional, what need is there for additional clinical data and what type of additional clinical data needed for MDR compliance. So this is super important if you want to retrofit your MDD certified device, for example, to be MDR compliant. It defines the range of well-established technologies per the MDR Article 61.6b, but this is a very tricky thing. Especially this last bullet is a very tricky thing because we have to recognize that the list in the MDR Article 61.6b are not examples of well-established technology devices. That's the complete list. So when it talks about screws and wedges and I don't know, plates or something like that, about different types of implantable devices, indeed, those types of devices, it's a precondition for those devices to be in the list for the MDR Article 61. But it doesn't mean, it doesn't work the other way around. So just because your device may also fulfill the definitions and the considerations of a well-established technology, it does not mean that you can automatically apply the exemptions that are listed in the MDR article. So just because your device is also a well-established technology, it doesn't mean that you will have some exemptions in the sampling or in the clinical evaluation section. So just be mindful about it, that it is not your right as a manufacturer to extend that list arbitrarily just because your device meets the definition of a well-established technology. That list can only be amended through an amendment in the MDR because it's a legal text, and therefore you cannot do it on your own. So just be mindful about this. And the second pitfall is that when manufacturers don't have sufficient clinical evidence for legacy devices, or it does not meet the guidance's requirement. And so maybe let's take a look at what type of evidence are we looking at. One of the critical parts of this guideline is Appendix 3, which ranks the different types of clinical evidence that you may have used under the MDD to in your clinical evaluation report. And so now you should take a second look at whether that clinical evidence, based on what types you have used, is really sufficient for your type of device under the MDR. And you will see that the first 4 types, so overall there's a dozen different types, the first 4 types are suitable to be used for class 3 and non-wet implantable devices. So if you have any such devices, then you must have under the MDD at least one such clinical data supporting your clinical evaluation report. If you don't have it, then you will need to generate more clinical data because it is considered that you don't have sufficient clinical data. So it is, and you can see that the top ranking data types are clinical investigations of different types, or outcomes from high quality clinical data collection systems such as registries without putting it together as a formal clinical investigation, or outcomes from studies with potential methodological flaws, but where the data can still be quantified and acceptably justified. So these are largely investigation type data. And then everything else underneath, you can already see that if your previous clinical data was only based on equivalence or state of the art or bench reports or anything like that, that cannot be used for these high-risk devices under the MDR. So if that's the case, if you only have everything under the red, that will not be sufficient. You will need to generate at least one type of clinical evidence. You will need to have a new baseline clinical investigation, pretty much. So let's talk about post-market. Post-market and the reinforcement of the post-market along the same lines as the the rest of the MDR. They have put a lot of premium on transparency to the different stakeholders and the general public. And so the reinforced concepts here also work towards putting the end users and the patients in a position where they can make informed consent, or whether to use the device or not, or whether to use something else. And to this end, there are two documents that are kind of new, but both work kind of towards the same goal, but just different stakeholders. So the PSUR, I already mentioned this, regulated by MDR Article 86. The scope is all devices. The purpose is for the competent authorities to have an overview of the device's continued post-market significance, performance, and safety. Target audience is just the competent authorities. The PSUR data collection started in 2021-5/26, or the MDR certification date, whichever is later. And it has to be updated periodically depending on the classes, and you can see the further details in the MDCG guideline. The SSCP is almost like a safety data sheet for the device, generally speaking. Maybe that's the closest analogy. The scope is only implantable and class 3 devices without custom-made or investigational devices. The purpose is to provide healthcare workers and relevant parties access to current clinical data, in addition to other information about the safety and clinical performance of the medical device. It is not for general advice on the diagnosis or treatment of a particular medical condition. It is not to replace the IFU or to replace the implant card. So it's an entity on its own. There are usually 2 parts of the SSCP. One is for the users, which are typical, if you think about implantable and class 3 devices, these are typically healthcare professionals. So the language and the terminology really speaks to them. And then the second part, which talks about the patient. So the patients read this and they will understand if this device is good for them, what are the alternatives, because you have to mention the state of the art, and they will be in a position to decide whether they want this device to be used on them or not. And if they choose to use it, what are the contraindications, what are the side effects, so they will be in a position to make a more informed decision. The updates are only needed as the contents change and for class 3 per every recertification. And there's also an MDCG guideline that goes with that. So you can see also in the guideline, you can see the different contents, but it is very clear that the PSUR is more post-market focused. So it talks about post-market data, sales volumes, complaints data, description and rationale for any CAPAs taken, benefit risk profile, and post-market clinical follow-up insights gained from the last update. The SSCP, on the other hand, talks about device identification, manufacturer, single registration number, basic UDI to identify the device, then the intended purpose, description of the device and practices, accessories, and other relevant system it's used with, residual risk, clinical evaluation report summary, possible diagnosis and therapeutic alternatives, suggested user profile and training, harmonized standards and common specifications applied, revision history, and the language should be suitable for the target audience and should be translated as necessary. We talked about this. It should be included in the manufacturer's website. And both of this information will add up and will be there or derived from the clinical evaluation report. The last thing is that I want to talk about is the scrutiny process. So for certain devices, class 3 implantable devices, class 2B active devices intended to administer and or remove medicinal products, there is a scrutiny process. So the notified body should or shall notify the competent authorities upon issuing the certificates covering these devices via UDAMED. And we need to include certain information, like this is supposed to be SSCP, CAR, that's our evaluation report, the original clinical evaluation report, IFU, expert panel, scientific opinion as applicable. And based on this, the competent authorities are going to review this, and they will decide whether we were right to issue a certificate for device or they can challenge this. So far, out of all the hundreds of MDR certificates that have been issued, or maybe already thousands of MDR certificates that have been issued, my information that only 23 such decisions have been made and none have been overturned or challenged. So this just shows you that this is a relatively rare occasion, but nevertheless, it's a new element. All right, I think that was from my side. I will hand it back to Greg.
Thank you, Balázs. So we do have some trainings online. Feel free to contact me if you want to discuss it further. On the next slide, we'll have our email addresses, but scheduled for October internal auditor training and in December MDR implementation training. So again, if you want to discuss it, please send me an email. We can set up a call. That will do it for our webinar today. We do have a couple of questions in our Q&A box. Balázs, you want me to read them out and you handle them? Balázs.
I was on mute. So the first question is, do we need a separate PMS report even though we have a PMCF report and the PSUR? Yes, based on the diagram that I have showed before, these are different deliverables. So let me just push it. So you can see that the PMS report, the PMCF report, and the PSUR are related to one another, but they have distinct content. And the MDR in different articles explicitly explains what is the content. You can see there's interaction between them, so they are not completely separate. In some cases, you want to copy some information from one to the other, or maybe you can just refer to from one to the other. But overall, the conclusions to each of these reports are distinct, and so you will need to generate all of these different deliverables and need to maintain them as required by the MDR. The next one, do all devices need CDP? No, the clinical development plan is only needed if you do clinical investigations. So if you find that you already have sufficient clinical data, or if you find that you can have sufficient clinical data without clinical investigation, then you also don't need to have clinical development plan. You only need to do it if you have at least one clinical investigation needed for your product. The next one is for PSUR contents. You mentioned PMCF insight. Can you elaborate on that? Yes. So basically, you will need to, whatever your PMCF, because the PMCF basically now includes the update to the clinical evaluation report, and that also already enrolls some of the updates. So basically, when you do the periodic update to the clinical evaluation, you will review the new scientific articles. So for example, if you do it every year, you will now limit your search. The time limit of your search is just the articles published in the last 12 months, for example, and then you will see what is new. And you will also see, you know, maybe in the meantime, some of our clinical investigations have been completed, or a follow-up clinical investigation has been completed, and all of those will provide some results. And then you will summarize these results, and maybe that's also part of the updated conclusion to your clinical evaluation report, to say that, you know, previously maybe some of the articles were inconclusive, now it has been concluded, but the outcome is still favorable, or now we have found some new evidence that is a little bit concerning, and we are going to monitor this, because it turns out that while the device has short-term benefits, in the long term it might have some you know, toxicology concerns or some other type of long-term effects. And you would notify the competent authorities about these new developments. So it's basically just giving them the updates for them to learn how this technology, how this space within medical devices is evolving. So it's a little bit of a short summary to inform them and keep the authorities up to date of where your device and similar devices are going. So it's more just like digesting the information for them to put them in a more knowledgeable position. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it.
That's all the questions in the box, Balázs.
Very good, very good, very good questions. Thank you very much.
So unless there's nothing else, I believe that will be it. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. We appreciate you coming on. Again, there'll be a survey. You'll get an email with a link to the recording and also a copy of the presentation. If you want to have a chat with Balázs or myself, we're happy to schedule some time. And again, thank you for coming today.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good one. Bye-bye.